Gustavo, and I want to thank everyone for attending. I am really honored to be here. I was in Brazil many years ago with Paulo Freire. I have very fond memories of Brazil, to say the very least. And today, I'm basically going to build on the notion of inequality by framing it within the context of the pandemic. And the pandemic, in this sense, is not just a medical issue. It's also a pandemic that refers to political and pedagogical crises, and what that means in terms of the times in which we live, particularly with the rise of various forms of authoritarianism. So with that said, let me begin. We now live in a world that resembles a dystopian novel that could only be imagined as a harrowing work of fiction or biting political commentary. If you think of the works of George Orwell, Sinclair Lewis, and others who have written in this venue, their work now almost appears as an understatement in a world marked by horrifying political horizons. This is a world in which authoritarian and medical pandemics have merged. In this age of uncertainty, time and space have collapsed into an abyss of shared apprehensions, relentless anxieties, and the possibility of an authoritarian abyss. The terror of everyday life points to a world that has begun, so it appears, to descend into darkness. Death and sickness haunt our existence as the pandemic spreads through those establishments, those spaces, materials that impact on the most intimate aspects of our daily lives. Images of fear, if not apocalyptic visions, flood the news as increasing numbers of people either get sick or die from the COVID-19 virus. We can no longer shake hands, embrace our friends, feel safe using public transportation, sitting inside a restaurant or a movie theater. Doorknobs, counters, the breath we inhale, and anything else that offers the virus a resting place has become comparable to a kind of ticking bomb, ready to explode, resulting in massive suffering and, to say the very least, untold deaths. Long-term stretches of self-isolation for the privileged begin to feel, so the press reports, like a form of imprisonment. But on the other hand, for the poor, the disadvantaged, and the elderly, there are no safe places. Only the daily risk of contamination, sickness, or worse. Amid this collective terror, the architecture of authoritarianism has resurfaced with a vengeance, especially in the United States, and in a more minor key, to say the very least, in Brazil, in the form of a kind of waking nightmare with a cast of horrors. Surveillance technologies proliferate. Armed militia defend groups refusing to wear protective masks and intimidate those who do. Voter suppression in the United States has preceded the presidential election in full swing. Conspiracy theories are now pushed by President Trump even after his defeat. Immigrant children were forcibly separated from their parents and put in cages in migrant detention centers, sometimes with no hopes of reuniting with their families. The COVID-19 plague points to more than a medical pandemic and must be understood within a more comprehensive historical, political, and ideological context. The COVID-19 crisis is deeply rooted in years of neglect by neoliberal governments that denied the importance of public health, the public good, and the commons, while defunding institutions that made them possible. The current pandemic cannot be removed from the crisis of massive inequalities in wealth, income, and power that have grown relentlessly since the 1970s. In this case, the disproportionate effects of the virus on those marginalized by race, by class, and age can be seen as part of the long-standing and broader struggles over public health, goods, social protections, services, and human rights, with special provisions for the most vulnerable, including the precariat, migrant workers, and indigenous peoples. not to mention, of course, the elderly. None of these issues can be separated from the broader struggles for social equality, economic justice, and democracy. Nor can the current pandemic be separated from the crisis of democratic values, critical education, and the civic imagination. Underlying the current magnitude of the current pandemics we now face, there's the crucial question of what kind of world do we want to live in today? What kind of world do we want to build for young people, for future generations? The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the ugly and cruel face of an extreme form of capitalism, which has relentlessly attacked the social contract, the public sphere, and the common good. Bear with me as I will use the term neoliberalism to define this libertarian, market-driven form of casino capitalism, which gained prominence in Chile under General Pinochet in the 1970s. Soon afterwards, as we all know, it was embraced by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, who infamously said, "There's no such thing as society. There's only individual men and women and their families." In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan in the United States joined Thatcher and argued that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. These ideas, of course, were later embraced with great enthusiasm by not only Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, but also currently by Bolsonaro in Brazil, of course, in India, in Hungary, in Poland, and a number of other countries. This lingering malignancy now dominates, in many ways, states that were formerly democratic, but are now increasingly moving towards the status of becoming authoritarian dictatorial societies. Central to these societies is a neoliberal worldview that argues in different ways that the market should govern not only the economy, but all of society. In addition, it promotes untrampled self-interest, indulgent individualism, a survival of the fittest ethos, and most of all, it removes economic activity from social cost. Ultimately, in doing this, it removes political and economic activity from the very notion of ethics and social responsibility. Its ultimate purpose is the concentration of wealth, of course, in the hands of a financial elite. Neoliberal fascism views government as the enemy of the market, embraces a fixed hedonism, and challenges the very idea of the common good. Moreover, it represents a new social and political formation that combines the harshest elements of a cutthroat capitalism with an unabashed embrace of white supremacy and what I would call, and Gustavo and I have talked about this, a politics of disposability. Neoliberal fascism has created, particularly in the United States, through its destruction of the economy, the environment, education, and public health care, a kind of petri dish for COVID-19 to wreak havoc and wide-scale destruction. And of course, you know better than I, this is also true for Brazil under the incompetent and corrupt Bolsonaro. What the COVID-19 crisis made clear is that the market could not provide basic social provisions and meet public health needs posed by the pandemic. Its anti-public and anti-democratic ethos was at odds with the crucial demands of civic leadership, given its long-standing belief that the priority of capital, capital should take priority over human needs. Not surprisingly, over time, public goods have withered and begun to fail. That is, the publicly owned bones of society, public education, public health system, roads, bridges, water systems, were underfunded and pushed to the breaking point of disrepair and dysfunctionality. Drained of civic values and lacking a commanding vision, the institutions of liberal democracy atrophied, undermining not only civic obligations, informed and engaged citizens, but also historical memory and the capacity to discern the truth from falsehoods. It must be made clear that neoliberalism is not just an economic system, but also an ideological and cultural system that functions as a powerful educational force. Its presence is on display in the rise of corporate controlled social media, that have accelerated a culture of surveillance, consumption, immediacy, and in many ways, self-absorption. In this overabundance of civic glut, language has succumbed to the aesthetics of vulgarity. What is new about the current historical moment is that the attack on the welfare state, the common good, and those considered disposable is increasingly legitimated through oppressive forms of education in a variety of sites, such as newspapers, social media, magazines, and popular culture. The merging of culture, power, and politics represents a new stage in the development of capitalist society, one that is, of course, accelerated by the new technologies, one in which left-leaning and mainstream cultural apparatuses, from schools to the digital media, are now under attack, while the right-wing media, which has enormous amounts of money and capital and power at its disposal, push authoritarian impulses and minority rule, displacing the necessity of tanks or massive displays of state violence in some cases. Authoritarian populism and economic nationalism are now normalized in an anti-democratic culture that is constructed through the deep grammar of education that intensifies the struggle over consciousness, over agency, and over values in a wide variety of sites. I mean, this is a struggle over agency. This is not just simply a struggle over power or a struggle over economic apparatuses. It's a struggle of over how we define ourselves, our relationship to others, and of course, the larger world. This is a stage and landscape in which willful ignorance, the disdain of science, the repudiation of evidence and expert advice are treated with either indifference or contempt, all of which is evident, of course, in Trump's denial regarding election results, not to mention his denial of the science behind what needs to happen with respect to, in some way, addressing the pandemic. Moreover, this culture of denial, with its contempt for evidence, justice, and democracy, is reinforced and reciprocated at the highest levels of government. Far from being objective sources of information or innocent forms of entertainment, new and powerful cultural apparatuses have become disinformation and disimagination machines that dehumanize people of color, promote spectacles of violence, militarize public space, and endorse consumerism as the only viable form of citizenship. This emptying out of social relationships, democratic values, and visions of the good life is a powerful force for legitimating and normalizing a language of exclusion, white supremacy, militarism, and ultranationalism. It's an attempt to destroy any viable notion of democracy as a foundation for civic and political life as we know it and as we have known it. One result is that the distinction between fact and fiction disappears. And somewhere along the way, the democratization of the flow of information becomes the democratization of the flow of disinformation. Lost here is a critical language capable of producing a narrative that promotes shared values and enables people to develop sustained connections crucial to a vibrant democracy. All of this is on display in Trump's campaign of misinformation and lies about both the pandemic and about almost everything else. And of course, again, this is entirely true of Bolsonaro. As a tabloid anti-intellectual who thrives in a culture of spectacle, entertainment, and distraction, Trump drains politics of any substantive meaning, given his attempts to both infantilize and to depoliticize the public, while disdaining any effort at critical analysis, translation, or self-reflection. Trump's ignorance, in some ways, and I would say this is true for Bolsonaro as well, is almost hallucinatory in that it operates out of an alternative reality that is so removed from reality that it speaks to a pathology so deep-seated, it becomes difficult actually at times to categorize. And all that's left in the midst of this is what the great theorist Viktor Frankl once called the mask of nihilism. The alarm and fear produced by the pandemic often blinds us to the fact that a range of anti-democratic and economic and political forces have been grinding away at the social order for the last 50 years. As engaged citizens, it's crucial, it would seem to me, to examine the anti-democratic and inequitous political, economic, and social forces that in many ways have fed the pandemic, and it seems to me to struggle at the same time for public health and the common good by linking struggles for emancipation, equity, and economic justice to democracy itself. What is difficult to understand today is that oppressive forms of education have now become central elements of a society threatened by a number of pandemics that endanger human life and the planet itself. The propaganda machines of the right-wing media echo the Trump regime's support for disparaging ideas, for lies about testing, and fake cures for the virus. Remember, this was a president who once suggested we should inject bleach into our blood systems to somehow prevent ourselves from getting the virus. It seems to me that the coronavirus pandemic now works in tandem with corporate media conglomerates to produce identities narrowly defined by market values, while normalizing stripped down notions of individual responsibility that convinces people that whatever problems that they face in some way have no one to blame but themselves. In this logic, individual interests are the only reality that really matters, and those interests are purely monetary. This, to me, is one of the most deadly elements of neoliberalism, because it basically says that all problems are basically individual problems. And when we argue that, it seems to me that what we do is we prevent people from being able to translate private issues into larger social considerations. And so it seems to me this ideology seems to suggest that there are only individual solutions to socially produced problems. This is a massive form of depoliticization. This ideology reinforces states of individual isolation and alienation, while it increasingly renders human beings numb, fearful, and immune to the demands of economic and social justice, all of which are increasingly removed from matters of politics or matters of ethics and from matters of social responsibility. Dealing with life's problems becomes a solitary affair, reducing matters of social responsibility to a regressive and depoliticized notion of individual choice. In this instance, the political becomes regressively personal, rendering difficult any critical understanding, as I've said earlier, of wider systemic forces, while undermining any viable notion of critical agency, and particularly collective resistance. As the connections between education and democracy wither, hope becomes the enemy of agency. And agency is reduced to learning how to survive rather than working to improve the conditions that bear down on one's life and society in general. This paralyzing form of depoliticization, with its refiguring of the social sphere, more like its elimination of the social sphere, individual responsibility, historical memory, critical thinking, and collective identity, reinforces an acute indifference, withdrawal from public life, and a disdain for politics, or a disdain for politics, contributing further to the loss of what we might call the habits of engaged and critical citizenship. The pandemic has shattered the myth that each of us are defined exclusively by our self-interest, and as individuals are solely responsible for the problems that we face. Both myths run the risk of breaking down as it becomes obvious that as the pandemic unfolds, shortages in crucial medical equipment, lack of testing, lack of public investments, and a failed public health services are largely due to right-wing neoliberal measures such as regressive tax policies, bloated military budgets, and other such expenses that have drained resources from public health, public goods, and other vital social institutions such as public and higher education. All of this, of course, also succumbs to the logic of privatization, the logic of consumerism, commercialism, efficiency, and standardization. Unfortunately, the political and economic crisis many countries are experiencing has not been matched by what I call a crisis of ideas. That is, a critical understanding of the conditions that produced the crisis in the first place. Within this crisis of ideas, matters of poverty, class difference, and racial injustices disappear. The COVID plague has produced an age of uncertainty, fragmentation, and despair, and a dire foreboding about the future. More troubling is the apprehension that the present crisis has an air of longevity about it, constituting what seems to be an almost irreversible turning point in history. The good news is that the pandemic has revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of institutional racism, the increasingly dangerous assault on the environment, and an anti-intellectual culture that derides the notion of critical education. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, engage in thoughtful dialogue, learn the lessons of history, and develop the capacity, at the very most, to hold power accountable.